So welcome to another edition of Rugged Wisdom Podcast. Today we're talking about books every man should read, but probably hasn't, because you probably watched the movie. You saw it as a kid, Pinocchio. That's right, we're jumping into Carlo Collodi's Adventures of Pinocchio, the original Italian version. We're going to jump into these themes and why this book is actually something every man should read. Probably going to hear me go off on Disney and woke culture. So let's just jump right into the episode. Welcome to the Rugged Wisdom Podcast, hosted by myself, Scott Johnson, and my buddy, Joe Wedra. Join us each week as we discuss timeless truths, share great stories, and create momentum in our daily lives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share wherever you enjoy this podcast. We greatly appreciate it. And now, let's get on with the show.
Well, welcome back in Rugged Wisdom. I'm Joe Wedra, Scott Johnson, another book review today, and I'm pretty excited about it.
I love it. This is the episode that we like to title Books Every Man Should Read, but probably hasn't. And that sounds a little pretentious to say.
But I like it.
Every man hasn't. But the fact is, today's book, I don't know that many people have actually read the book, but if I were to say Pinocchio, they're like, yeah, I watched the movie.
We're familiar with some form of adaptation of Pinocchio.
Sure they are. But today we're going to be jumping into Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio, the original book that was written in the 19th century. And we're going to get into some ideas about what's in the book. And then we're really going to get into, well, what does it mean? Or why should a man read this and why you should have a working knowledge?
Particularly how it differs to the traditional view of Pinocchio. Because truthfully, before we discuss this, I had a little familiarity with the book, but it's jarring, actually.
Yeah, sure it is. But I want to get into also about, well, this is at the head of it. I'll just say woke agenda and how it changes books or how it adapts even some of the major themes of the book. And people actually hear me even I might even go off a little bit.
Yeah, it's a rewrite.
I mean, it is a rewrite, and I find that to be an egregious error. Yeah. But also, I would say even like Collodi would be like, what are you doing? Yeah. With that. So let's jump into it. So in the A block, the segment, let's get into who was Carlo Collodi. That's the first thing I want to get into. When I say that, what comes to mind?
Well, at first it would be Pinocchio, right? But really, obviously, this idea of what's surrounding Italy at the time, what's surrounding, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But, I'm curious, the whole Carlo Collodi thing, I was researching him a lot, even this morning there's some depth here.
Oh, yeah.
That is needed, important, and I would say vital to understanding the book as a whole. So I kind of want to jump in there.
Yeah, so to talk about Carlo Collodi and why you should even care about Pinocchio. Like, why should I? Isn't this like a kid's movie? Like, well, not really. It's actually
not at all.
Actually, one of Italy's greatest pieces of literature. Now, I'm not saying that. I'm not qualified to tell you what are the Italian masterpieces. Right. But this is heralded as one of Italy's greatest literary masterpieces, and we should know. But okay, well, why is that? Well, we got to get a little bit into history. And now, interestingly enough, to talk about Carlo Collodi, which isn't his real name, by the way, it's a pen name.
Spoiler alert.
It's not his real name. And there's a reason that he uses a pen name. Kind of like Samuel Clemens with Mark Twain, but a little bit different. So to understand this book, we got to start with Napoleon. Above all people. Like, okay, how are you going to connect Napoleon, the French emperor, ruler, with Carlo Collodi?
To Pinocchio.
Well, actually, it's a very simple thing. It's actually, you kind of got to understand, because let me start with this, and I made a few notes because I want to make sure I get these dates right. In 1814, Napoleon abdicated his rule, and he actually kind of self-abdicated, and he saw the writing on the wall, and he recluded himself to an island, Elba. But that kind of sets the scene, because what France at the time was controlling a lot of the Italian area, like the area of Italy. And so right before Collodi, or Carlo Lorenzi, we'll talk about his name in a second, before he was born, you kind of got to understand in 1814, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed, and that's when Napoleon's like, all right, I'm out. And it's really a dramatic piece of French and world history, European history at that time. He kisses the flag and he tells his soldiers, carry on and fight for France. That's always what I wanted to do. That's kind of the setting, because the Italian states at the time, Italy is not a unified, it's territories that are ruled by different people. So when Carlo Collodi is born, he's born into this kind of an era. So I would say 12 years before he was born, that's when Napoleon abdicated his leadership. So that puts, if that helps you kind of like, when was this
Where
guy?
we at?
Where are we at in history, and why is that? It's because when Carlo Lorenzini is his real
Not
name.
Collodi.
Not Collodi. It is a pen name. So Carlo Lorenzini. So if I say, we'll just say Carlo.
Right.
Because sometimes when we say Lorenzini or Collodi, we're saying the same person. He was born in 1826. Now, he was born at the ripe age where Italy, as an Italian, like this peninsula, right? They were all these city-states, or like kind of like territories. And there's a quest for, like, we want to be a nation.
Some type of unity.
A unity. And so he's born into that. So now your formative years. Now this is important, because to understand Pinocchio, you got to understand that, think of it as an American. Okay, so we had the colonies, and you got the 13 colonies of the 1700s. And so kind of, let's say it's 1750, and you're thinking, man, we would be great if we were just like on our own, ruling ourselves. And so as an American, we would go, okay, so if you're born in 1750 and you're at the ripe age of the 1770 to help join the fight against the British, you're like, oh, I understand like how you're born into that. Carlo is born into this culture of a people going like the Italians going, we would like to be our own nation. Ruling ourselves. We've been ruled by people like Napoleon. The Prussians are ruling. The Austrians are ruling.
Probably
us.
like an identity crisis too at this time.
Well,
like, who are we? What are we doing?
Okay, and also, well, there's a lot of abject poverty, and you've got a bunch of rulers and a lot of the haves and the have-nots. Right. So Carlo's born into this because when he is actually 22, the first Italian war for independence sparked up. There were 3.
So we're in 1848.
Yeah, so now he fights in 2 of those, but so he's 22 years of age. Now let me back up a little bit, because Carlo Collodi, to understand Pinocchio, you got to understand this guy he's an Italian. He goes to school, but his parents send him off to live with his family. His mom is she's a teacher. His dad is they actually work for some people, and they send Carlo Collodi off to be part with his family about 40 miles north or west of Florence. He spent a lot of his time with some extended family. So he grew up not in like a family that was like, every night I eat at the table with my mom and dad.
Very non-traditional to our understanding.
That's right. So because his parents were they were, I won't say servants, but they worked in a large, like an estate for some people. So you kind of grew up, well, my parents work for this family, but they kind of farm me out and I'm raised over here. So, okay, so that is an important psychological piece. You're kind of raised in a haves and a haves not society.
In a world that for Italy at this point, it's very, and what I'm saying is everything around him is, I don't want to say in flux, but it is. There's nothing really, the unification part.
When he was in school, he actually worked at a bookstore. It was a bookshop. And this bookshop also functioned as a publisher. Now that's important because because before he's 22, Carlo Collodi is working in this bookstore. And his job is to work in the bookstore. He's not an author. He's not doing this.
He's just there.
But there's a lot of dudes who come into the bookstore, and he overhears a lot of his, I'll call elder statesmen, who are thinkers, great thinkers. They're influencers, and they come to the bookstore and they sit around and they talk. It's a little bit like a speakeasy.
It's the parallel, I think, of like C.S. Lewis and I mean, you're in a pub. And you're just kind of talking Tolkien. Yeah, Tolkien. And it's very similar. I mean, different setting. It is similar.
So you have Carlo Collodi. He's a young guy working in a bookstore. And he's like, why he's sweeping the floor. why he's putting books on the shelves, why he's just doing. He's listening to all these dudes in the neighborhood talk about what independence would look like as a unified Italy. And we want to rule ourselves. And we want to rule ourselves in such a way. So that's heavily influenced upon him. Now that's important because to understand Pinocchio, you got to understand Italy's quest for independence in a unified nation. And so he's at the age of 22, the first Italian war breaks out for independence. And so we know that is in 1848. He's 22. And so he fights in that war. Now he goes to, it's not successful. All right. And so he comes back. And another thing that's important to know is through this time, he actually is a seminary student.
That's right.
Briefly. But decides to leave seminary for the war effort.
I was reading, I don't think there's any idea of how long that was. It was a relatively short period.
This is a little, I just can't find. Okay, I really had to dig on this.
But it shows you that what's going on in his mind. There's something there from our perspective. Now we see there's something there that these thoughts.
He is a theological thinker. Now, I want to make a big deal about this because Carlo Collodi Lorenzini, he is he's very smart. He actually later on coins a lot of Italian words. Like you can't even underestimate that. He's a wordsmith in the truest form. Like he helps write the Italian dictionary in a way. But he is a theologian early on. I mean, he wanted to be a priest. But he actually, I don't understand this. This is something I had to go deeper on. But he was in seminary for a short amount of time, but left that for the war effort. Now, so that's important. You got a guy who's growing up in a nation-ish that's wanting to be unified under, like, we want to be one nation. We're all these little city-states. We've got a king here. We've got a dude here. We've got the French and the Austrians telling us what to do. But he's a theological thinker. All of that is a ground bed for Pinocchio. Because, so he fights in the first skirmish for independence in 1848. The Second War of Independence is in 1859. He's 33. He would be 33 at that time.
So we're about 11 years after the first.
Yeah. So there's 11-year span between. So let me say this for our American friends.
Yeah.
We had the Revolutionary War over a period of years, and we were successful.
Yep.
The Italians had 3 Revolutionary Wars, and it took the third one to finalize it. Okay, so it was a war effort that went through all of Collodi, his whole adult life.
That's what he knew.
He was 22. The first, we'll call it Revolutionary War, if to use American parlance. He's 22. 33 years of age. He fights in the second war. He does not fight in the third because he's too old.
Yeah.
But that's so important because just here's the history of Italy. In 1848, the First Italian War, 1859, the second. The third war for independence, he's 40 years old.
1866.
1866. Now, think about that, all right? That is parallel to the Civil War. And if helping you understand, when is this in history?
Right, where are we at?
Where are we at in history? That is parallel to the Civil War in the United States. That would be 1860 to 1865, if I'm not mistaken. So if you want to help you think of like, when was this? Well, this is synonymous time-wise with the Civil War in the United States, is when Italy is becoming a nation. A lot of people don't think Italy is actually a very young nation.
That's not what first comes to mind because of the rich traditions of Italy. You tend to think of age.
Well, you think about Rome.
Sure.
You think about Rome and you think about the Roman Empire. Yeah. So, man, like we're going back. Okay, you're talking about, Rome comes to a world power in early BC, about 100 BC.
Yeah.
And then, so you have these Roman people who show up through history. But Italy, as we know it today, is a relatively young country.
I think that would surprise a lot of people.
If I were to tell you that Italy as a nation is younger than the United States of America, people were like, well, what are you talking about?
There's no way.
But it's true. The third war for independence happens in 1859. 1866, and he's 40 years old. Now, there's a period of time, about 5 years, between that and the unification of Italy. 1871 is really the date that you have to give Italy. The United States is roughly 100 years older than the nation of Italy.
It would surprise people.
That might be. So there you go. Well, that might be.
That's the one fun fact.
That's the fun fact for today. Now, why is this relative to Pinocchio? Because let me take you back to the bookshop. He's let's put him in at 18, 19 years of age, or maybe 17. He might be a little bit younger than that. He's working in a bookstore. He's hearing ideas of these designing men. I call them designing men. That's actually that's a nod to another time in history. But these designing men who are saying like, man, you know what it would be like to be like our own nation, and they were talking about very democratic ideas, but not only democratic ideas, because they're also watching, the United States of America.
They're seeing what's going on.
They're seeing around the world, like, what would it look like to be self-governing from foreign powers? So, okay, so that's a thing. And that's why I say we have to start with Napoleon, because that's kind of, when Napoleon abdicated, that kind of set the opportunity for them to, okay, well, we actually want to be independent and to not have foreign powers telling us what to do. What does that mean? So he's thinking, man, I'd love to be a part of that. Well, when you get to understanding the backdrop of Pinocchio, what they wanted was not just democratic ideas. They wanted a federal government. And what, in the best sense, in the United States, we have a federal government. We have states and a central government. What Carlo, Collodi, or Lorenzini, what he and his contemporaries wanted was a federal government that was weak or small in states that had power. Okay, United States. The states have power. Right. We have a federal system, but the power, for example, let's take capital punishment. I just really pulling one. Okay, that is at the state level. There are certain things the states decides, and there are certain things the federal government decides. Now, we have a conversation, right, in our culture today that says, I want a strong government in the weak state, or I want a strong state in a, when I say weak government, meaning like less involved. We want to govern ourselves as a state. I want South Carolina to make rules and decide for itself. I don't want California making rules for me, right? And, well, that's shooting fish in the barrel there, but I'm just saying, okay. So for the Italians, what they wanted was a strong state government. So the little independents, like they would govern, but what they got was a strong centralized government and very weak local powers.
The exact opposite.
Well, it's the exact opposite of what Carlo and his contemporaries fought for. What they wanted was strong states and a government that was limited. What they got,
not that.
Because, how did they get that? Well, because they realized, and this is an interesting concession that they made, they knew that the only way to actually kind of get this independence was to concede to a monarchy. And so they had to concede to it. That was a concession that they had to make.
Significant one for them.
It is a very significant one. And so, in 1861, Italy declared its independence for the first time. He's 35. But basically, it's kind of they're growing. What does this mean? What does this look like? Now, they conceded to have a king be kind of, well, they're fighting the Austrians. They have the help of the French. But they were like, okay, we'll have a king, but he's a king like in the way that we have a president. He's a spokesperson.
Yes.
All right. So when they find out, well, we have a king, and realize what they have is now we've just empowered this king, and he's the king of Italy. And so now, why am I making a big deal of that? You will not understand the first line of the book,
which is wonderful once you actually dive into it.
You will not understand the first line of the Adventures of Pinocchio without understanding why they had a king and why Collodi hated.
It's a beautiful
He
satire.
hated the idea of a. Now that is it. It is this book is a work of satire.
Yes.
We know that, well, because Collodi says it's a work of satire. The opening line does two things, and will be our next segment. Like, what am I going to read, and how should I read it?
But this is important. This is
okay. So here's what I'm saying. Why is this a book that we should read? Well, it's because it is a book of a coming of an age man who decides the Pinocchio is the product of a guy who fought in 2 wars of independence, who had ideas about what governance should look like, but had a seminary in mind, meaning that he went to seminary briefly.
Right.
So that tells us something about
the backdrop.
Okay, but it tells us about him as a believer, because there are tones of Christology in their metaphors, and there are metatones, meta narratives, that you have to understand the theological background of Collodi, but also the Italian desire for independence. And this is the biggest thing. So, what does a man do? How do you act in the theater of culture if you are a citizen of a country that has fought for its independence? Now, why should a man read this book? We can learn from Collodi because, as me, as an American, well, as a guy who have theological convictions, but I have theological convictions, but I also live in a political realm. So how should I interact in the political realm?
Yeah.
Do I have duties? Should there be things I should think and do? Or how should I engage culture? That is what Pinocchio is about.
Believe it or not.
Unfortunately, that's not what the animation movie is about.
Not at all. We'll get into that.
We'll get into that, but I wanted to set the tone. Have we done it? Have I given enough background?
I think so. I'm intrigued, but I'm glad you brought up. We're going to segue into this after the quick break, but I'm glad you brought up that first line, because it is vital to understanding. Because I think if we don't understand that concept, you're going to read it completely. I don't want to say you're going to read it wrong, but you're not going to read it, I don't believe, the way it is intended to be read.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to read this line
Yep.
as a segue to get us into Pinocchio. So having understand that, I'm getting to the first chapter. So he says,
Love this.
once upon a time. Now, this is an English translation. Now that in itself, and I'll explain this, the Italian. Once upon a time, there was, and he gives points of ellipses. Here's the quote. A king, my little readers will no doubt say in a flash. No, kids, you got it wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. In the Italian, there was a blockhead. So it's a little bit lost.
Yeah.
In the English translation, there was a piece of wood, but it was a euphemism. Hey, we want a king, and he's like, no.
You got a piece of wood.
What you got is you got a blockhead. You got a piece of wood who doesn't understand how to think, and it doesn't understand. So now, why? Before we can get into the book, to understand the whole reason Collodi wrote Pinocchio was because we got to understand what kind of leaders we need to lead people. And why is that? Well, because this is a guy who's like, this has been my life for my whole life. Like, I've been a part of a nation that's wanted to be a unified nation and be independent and govern ourselves. And he fought in 2 revolutionary, because they're revolting against the foreign powers. He fought in 2 revolutionary wars and supported the 3rd.
Yeah.
And lived to tell the story.
Through his whole life.
All right. Okay. His whole life was a quest for independence. Yeah. And then if you're going to be independent, well, then what do I do with that?
Yeah.
And then Pinocchio is a response to, this is everything we have fought for, and this is what young men should do who come after me.
Yeah.
So that's the setup.
So what's in the book, you ask? We'll find out right here after the break.
Hey everybody, Scott here. I want to just break in the podcast for a second just to say thank you. Thank you for listening or watching, whether you're watching on YouTube or maybe you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or maybe iHeartRadio or anywhere that you're watching or listening. We're so thankful. Without you, well, there's really not a show. So it would just be me and Joe talking to ourselves. And so we're really, really thankful for you. And, you know, when you hit the like button, you subscribe, that really does help us out and really helps other people find the podcast. But above all, a personal recommendation, if you got a friend or someone who, you know, would benefit from the podcast or find it interesting, your recommendation to your friends is the best thing for the podcast. And we would really appreciate that. So, hey, we're going to get back into the show, but want to just stop for a second and say thanks for listening. And now back to the show.
Welcome back into Rugged Wisdom. We're talking Pinocchio, all things Pinocchio, and I feel like there maybe have been other podcasts that have discussed Pinocchio, but are they really discussing Pinocchio? That's what we're going to talk about in this segment.
I'm glad you brought that up because there's been a lot of press around Pinocchio in the last 3 years, and the reason there's been a lot of press around Pinocchio, well, was one, because it was a re-release in 2020. It was a kind of remake, come over live action type film, all CGI. And it has some notable people in it, Tom Hanks and some others. But also, not because of this the re-release in 2020, but also because of some work by Jordan Peterson and some other people who have done a lot of, and I think they've done a good, but he's looking at it as a clinical psychologist, and he's understanding like the tones of like what does it mean, the essence of being, as far as the psychological ramifications of Pinocchio. And I'm just going to relegate all of that to someone like Peterson, who's way smarter than I am, and does a good job as a clinical psychologist unpacking questions of psychological nature, and that's part of it. But I want to look at a broader scope, theological, historical, and also theological, but also practical.
Before we get into the nuts and bolts of Pinocchio, we mentioned at the top of the show how it has been altered, changed, whatever word you want to use there.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's not a disclaimer, but I want to talk about that just very briefly about what we're talking about in terms of how it doesn't necessarily hold. And I'm going to let you speak to that.
Well, I think that something that we should actually talk about is that what we're discussing is Pinocchio, The Adventures of Pinocchio, the series of writings, not the movie. Correct. We'll get into the movie in a bit, but I'm not talking about Disney's animated, and it is held up over time. I'm an animator, like that was my first career, was an animator. So for me to talk about Pinocchio, I understand what Pinocchio did. It pushed the limits of animation when it was released in 1940, 41, or I checked the dates on that in a minute. But what I'm talking about is the book itself. And so you're going to like, I don't remember that in the movie. And I'm like, I know, because it wasn't there. There are certain things that the movie did and has continued to do that, like, for example, we'll get into the we think Pinocchio, you think the nose. Right. That only happens twice in the book. It's actually not even like a thing. It's not like in the book, you would just not even, you kind of like, oh, okay. But it's not something that literally.
But that's our takeaway now.
Sticks out. Yeah. The Pinocchio, like we do that with like, how many Pinocchios does this politician get? Right. Interesting enough, that is like a small detail. In this book. There are bigger details. So let's get into more about the book itself, understanding, okay, here we say, who was the author? Carlo Lorenzini, a.k.a. Collodi. Now, do you know where he gets the name Collodi?
I do.
Yeah. You want to tell people where he got the name Collodi?
Well, you can fact check me. It's the town, correct?
Yes.
That he spent much of his time in formative years.
So there is a little debate. Do you celebrate Carlo from being from Florence or Collodi? And you could debate that. He is from both. He is from both.
But because that's where a lot of, I said formative years, but a lot of studying took place. A lot of it, and so I'm not actually sure, but I'm assuming that was, the decision to go with Collodi.
He went with Collodi. It's kind of like Scott from Aner, or it's like you drop your, and so his pen name was placing him on the map from a different place. Makes sense. So The Adventures of Pinocchio was not written as a book. That's the first thing people need to understand. Collodi was writing, and he was venturing into this world of satire. And he was writing, so it's called The Adventures, and it was written as a piecemeal.
For a newspaper.
Yeah,
right?
it is a newspaper. It's like kind of like an op-ed piece in a
Yeah.
way, but like a little satirical, little,
Yeah.
hey, here's something fun. But it's satirical because it's poking holes in the governmental system. But he's also trying to speak to the culture,
Right.
to the youth of the day. And he actually, there's some commentary where he says like, oh, you tried to make me think I was writing a kid's book. This is, and we'll see this in chapter 1. This is not a kid's book at all. It just sounds like a kid's book.
Yeah.
So he wrote this piecemeal. He would release a chapter, and I maybe every week or every
I read weekly,
or every edition. So it would be like chapter 1 and Pinocchio, and it was like, oh, that was cool. And then he'd write the second one.
We like this. Go ahead and write another one.
Yeah. So Pinocchio wasn't written, and I think this is what's so important to know. It doesn't appear that Collodi was thinking about the end of Pinocchio when he started.
Almost just was it the way I understood it is he's writing as he's going ultimately, and it's just let's figure it out. Oh, I got to write another edition, so here we go.
Yeah, and he would leave it open ended. Matter of fact, he would leave it open ended, which is one of my favorite parts. We'll get to. He leaves Pinocchio dead, hung on a tree, and almost to the demands of the public. They're like, "You got to keep writing," and he was like, "Okay, I'll keep writing."
Those themes sound familiar.
Later on in life, it was compiled. So that's something I want to start with. That it was written as adventures, piecemeal, one at a time, and to understand Pinocchio as the movie later on in 1940, and then we grew up watching it. To understand this was a piecemeal thing, someone didn't sit down like, oh, I'm going to write this one book all at once. I think that's the best. So let's talk about it. It is a work of satire, and that's part of the genius. Now, I want to go back to this opening line in the book, if we could, because you're like, hey, what should here's what I hope people, when they listen to this B block, this second segment, if I read this book, which is actually a really easy read.
It's very easy read.
You can read it. It's like
read.
I say, you could read a chapter, it's like 2 pages, and there's like, what is it, 33 of those or so, 31, 33?
It's quick.
So you can pick it up, put it down, pick it up, put it down, and it's intriguing. But the one thing that I'd say, like when you read this, listen to what he's saying. Once upon a time. Now that is a characteristic. We hear a lot of that in fairy tales. Now, once upon a time, here's what's different. Not about what Collodi puts in the book, but what's not there. Pop quiz. If I said, tell me a fairy tale, once upon a time, who would be the main characters? Heroes, kings, princesses,
usually
a dragon.
Fairy, king, queen, prince, princess.
Okay.
Hero.
All right.
That's what we've grown up
Every
knowing.
other, and let me just say, Disney book or drama or whatever, fairy tale, has a king, princess, some kind of a...
That's your hero.
Okay. You should notice right from the bat, there are no kings, there are no royalty. Now, that's interesting when you look at Disney's catalog. Pinocchio, for the longest time, stood out as one of the only piece of writings that did not have a monarchy as the cast. All right, why is that?
Well, what we just talked about.
What was the one thing? So, if you understand what's missing in Pinocchio, it's because it's the one thing they wanted gone.
I love how intentionally he is right away, too, of just saying, he's like, the king? Nope. There's no king.
So, once upon a time. Now that Sierra Una Volta, in my Italian, I don't speak Italian. I can read it enough because it's a language that you can kind of figure out. But Sierra Una Volta is Italian for, it's what we now know as once upon a time. But now that was a signature beginning line that the satirical writers, it was to tell everybody, hey y'all, this is satire.
You're preparing the reader at that point.
So once upon a time. Well, we should ask ourselves that question. Where do we get that language? Once upon a time. We just assume it. We've heard it our whole life. It's a given. We've heard it our whole life growing up. Once upon a time. And we go like, where does that even come from? Well, in the Italian, it was Sierra Una Volta. And which is a way to tell people, I'm going to tell you a story, but I'm going to tell you a story in the story.
Yeah. Sit down with me.
Sit down with me. Once upon a time, there was a king. My little readers will no doubt say in a flash, no kids, you got it wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. Now, okay, so listen to this. He says, "No, kids, you got it wrong." What do they have wrong? Well, it's in my opinion, heralding back to Israel. We want a king, and the prophet said, "You don't need a king." God said, and Samuel's like, "You don't need a king." Like, we want a king. And they're like, "We want a king," and they're like, "You don't need a king. Like, that's not how. That's not what's going to be good for you." Like, and no, we want a king. And so I would even hear these tones as a theological person saying, like, nations or people can go wrong when they want a monarch. And so, okay, so that's a little bit of a Old Testament toss back. But he's also speaking to the, quote, youth of the day, going, it's almost like, can I just call him a curmudgeon?
Right.
Like, you kids, get off my lawn. Hey, get off my lawn.
That's what makes his background, though, with theology and going to seminary for a brief period of time particularly interesting, because you can read this through those tones of saying, okay, here, because he's older when he's writing this text. So he's been through it all.
Well, imagine you're an older guy. You have fought and lived to tell the story.
Your whole life.
And now you're handing it off to a new generation of leaders.
That's a really good way to frame this, yeah.
Or you're watching them come into being, and you're scared because you're going, they're going to ruin it.
Yeah.
Like, I have fought for this. It's like I built something, and I'm about to hand this off.
How do I get the point across?
A bunch of jackasses.
Yeah, seriously.
Now, that's the literal, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, so why is it that, and you see this in animation, that they become donkeys when they go to the Neverland, or I forget the name of what they call it.
Toyland?
Toyland. Okay, they go there. Like, it's because, well, when you get sold off for labor, well, you just don't be a jackass.
Yeah.
And we'll see that. That's why they grow ears in the book. So, no, kids, you got it wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. And what he's saying at this is like, okay, I'm going to talk about like how, there is like, he's basically calling the king a blockhead. Going like, this dude doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Like, don't put your hopes.
But again, setting up the fact that this is going to be vastly different than every quote unquote fairy tale that we think we're familiar with.
Yeah, it is. So now when you read what's in Pinocchio, I think that's a few things you got to understand is like, there are no kings. There's no damsels in distress.
Yeah.
It's a coming of age story of he's not a real boy.
Right.
He's a puppet, that's okay. So, like, do you want to be a puppet on a string or to actualize and to become something more than that?
Well, it's this idea that at least something that I took away from it. You're a puppet, and you want to just be a normal boy. You want to be, and we get this, I guess, a little bit of a segue. But it's a book of misfortune.
Yes.
Where it's the fox, right?
Yeah.
Every turn you have, there's misfortune, which I found interesting too.
It reminds me a little bit of the Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, where the protagonists, so Lemony Snicket's, they fall into misfortune of no fault of their own. But the thing about Pinocchio is, here's the thing about Pinocchio. Disney, when they made the movie, they make him out to be this affable puppet, this little toy, and at Geppetto, which we'll get into that in a second, Geppetto means Joseph. And so he's a clockmaker. Actually, in the book, no, he's not like a fancy clockmaker. He's like a salt of the earth guy who makes very practical things. Pinocchio finds himself in misfortune because, well, he refuses to go to school, and he refuses to do what's right.
Here's a quick question for you. Was Pinocchio as lovable as the Disney adaptation makes?
No, they actually had to make Pinocchio lovable.
Which is so interesting.
Because it's almost that Pinocchio for Collodi is like a cautionary tale.
Yes.
But in Pinocchio the movie, it's like, well, we got to make kids love it.
Right.
He's got to be. For him. You got to root for him. He's got to be the underdog.
Yeah.
But Pinocchio for Collodi is basically this euphemism for the youth of the day, like, go to school, learn what you can, and contribute to society.
Yep.
Which so when you read Pinocchio, you're going to see this kid, this puppet going, I don't want to go to school. I want to waste my money. I want to trust the fox. I want to trust the cat. I want to trust these things. And finds himself in peril, and that peril is the result of our own misgivings.
Yes. It's there's depth. There's great depth, because the misfortunes we're talking about, they weren't, and I would even go to say this, it's probably it was intended. The misfortunes were not just random. They did not just happen. They were very much caused. There was a causation to the fortune,
Yes.
to misfortune, and it was, I don't know how else to say it, primarily Pinocchio's fault.
Well, usually in the arc of a story, the protagonists, like, well, they don't do anything wrong. Wrong things happen to them.
Right.
And they're kind of, well, they're the recipient of the malevolence and the misdeeds of society. But for Collodi, now this is a theological overtone, that the sin of Pinocchio is his own pride, and okay, let me say it this way. The problem that he sees in the Italian society isn't problems from without. It's not foreign governments.
Right.
Okay, it was, but that's not the problem. Like, we will be the undoing of our society if we're not careful. And so Pinocchio is this like misguided, like, I don't want to go to school. I want to go to the show. I want to go to the play.
Right.
I want to go on an adventure. And he's like, but if you follow your own desires, it will undo society.
Yeah.
That you have to be subservient to the higher goal, the higher good.
Yeah.
Now, that's a major tone. So when you read Pinocchio, we're not going to tell you what's in the book.
Right.
I mean, it's a short read. How to read Pinocchio.
It's worth it.
I do also want to give you some clues about what's Let's talk about Geppetto.
Yes.
The name. What does Geppetto mean? Well, Geppetto is an Italian nickname of Giuseppe, which is the Italian version of Joseph. Okay. So if Joseph has a boy that has to become something, and that in his becoming, it's the salvation, like, what is Collodi doing here?
Does that sound familiar?
Does it sound familiar? Would it surprise you that Joseph is a carpenter and Geppetto is a carpenter? Okay, so, all right, when you read it, you got to think, okay.
Got it.
Okay, Giuseppe or Geppo, that's Giuseppe, so that's Joseph in the Italian form of, so,
Carpenter.
Oh, Joseph the so this is a book about the carpenter's boy, Joseph the carpenter.
Yeah.
And what happens. And so now, well, that's interesting. And then it's also this idea of like, okay, he has to go into the world and to become something. Now, this is a question of like, I would love to ask Collodi, like, were you trying to do Christological overtones here, or did you just kind of like hint and nod?
Right.
And I love it because there's these mega themes that we see. Well, like, is there something inside of us that needs? Now, obviously, now that you could take that a long road theologically with Christology, it's not that Pinocchio is a little Christ,
right? But
the one episode where he left people hanging, Pinocchio is nailed to a tree and left for dead. These things are not in the 1940 animation.
I just have a thought, though, of as he's writing this, and I don't think you can read it and say that there wasn't some intentionality here. But,
100%.
But don't you think, and I'm just interested, if some of this was just a byproduct of those theological tones he grew up with, the idea of going to seminary. I just think that adds such a brilliant backdrop for this story of he was immersed. I mean, you go to seminary, you're not immersed in all of this. Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating how these themes come out. Now, I do think they were conscious if you read the book with this context, but it's interesting.
Well, okay, you hit the word conscious. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. Jiminy the Cricket, or the talking cricket.
Yep.
So for Collodi, why does he introduce the cricket? Well, we do see this in the animated version. Mm-hmm. The cricket is the external conscious of Pinocchio. It is the chirping conscience.
Constant.
It is so the cricket in Jiminy the Cricket in the Disney is where does conscious reside? External or internal? Later on, and spoiler alert, when consciousness is dwelt within, you no longer need the chirping cricket, and he can go on to his next journey. So what you have here is rationality, consciousness. The consciousness has to be something that we embody in itself, and there will become a limit to which consciousness can be. Like, you can't just live on other people's advice.
At some point.
At some point, you have to, it has to live within you.
Yeah.
And you can't just, like, you have to become something.
Sure.
And so, okay, when you read it, read theological, but also read the idea of consciousness. Okay. Theological overtone. Is it that the Holy Spirit is out here, or the Holy Spirit leads and lives within me as and instructs me? So, okay, well, for culture to become self-actualized into its greatest form, then they would have this consciousness that was once outside of them.
It is now within. Within
them, the advocate, the Holy Spirit. So in a way, I would encourage you to consider Jiminy the Cricket as a hint towards the Holy Spirit.
Let's be clear. I don't think that's far-fetched at all.
It's not.
I think when you examine and sit down critically and say, just let's take that example. If I want to examine it this way, if you ask yourself, should I think you'll find many reasons to say that makes sense.
What I love about this, when I went back and reread the book, I remember I told you, it's like, we're going to do Pinocchio. And you're like, really?
Well, it is. That's your first thought, right? I was like, okay.
And I'm like, dude, but
let's see where we go.
This book is so I wish someone had told me about this book long ago, because I just watched the Disney version growing up, going like, oh, that's Pinocchio. And they're like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not, because, and we're going to get into the why segment next. But why should a man read this? Well, okay, when I read this book and I know, I need to pay attention to why Collodi is having Pinocchio do this, and what is Pinocchio running from? What am I running from? Yeah. And what should I be doing with my life? And this is the perfect book for a man who is like, what should I be doing with my life?
Yeah. Knowing
that people have fought for freedoms, both politically and religiously, and theologically. And that's a soteriological question. So how do I respond to freedom? Yeah. What rights, duties, and privileges come with that? And how do I engage culture and not be a jackass?
Yeah.
That's literally like, okay, that's the part. They want to go to Wonderland, and if you go there, and if you live to your senses in the Epicurean way, the Epicurean life, just come out here and have fun. Here's what I love about the original. Is that they go there to smoke cigars and drink beer.
Yeah.
And they get so sick on it. You know, there's like a disclaimer now on the Netflix version, or the Disney version of Pinocchio, that it warns about, like, be careful, your kids are going to see this because they're smoking cigars and chewing tobacco. Because that's like the thing in here. Like, we just want to chew tobacco, smoke cigars, and drink beer. Yeah, so do I. Okay. But can I trust that?
Right.
And not end up being, the Italian is like, you're being a jackass.
Right.
Well, that's why they grow ears. That's the symbology. So, okay, let's get into why. Yeah. I think, okay, we've told who Carlo is. We've said, here's how you should read the book. Here's what's the book. What I want to jump into this third block is like, what do I do with that? Yeah. Like, what's the practical reasons, and what are my takeaways? What are your takeaways from the book?
Yep. And
how that helps me, and why I think other people should read it.
And I just love that we're talking about what book should you read in this formative part of your life, Pinocchio.
I know it's not what you would expect, but that's what this show is about. Is wisdom that's been around for a long time. Perhaps we've overlooked it.
That's why we're here. We'll talk about all that and more coming up next.
1, 2, 3.
Hey everybody, Scott here. Want to thank you so much. If you're watching this podcast on YouTube, or maybe you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, thank you for doing that. For everyone who clicks the like and subscribe and they share it on their profile, thank you, because I believe that's the highest compliment that someone can do with anything that you make, is share it with your friends. So we appreciate you doing that, and helps it make it more discoverable. So thank you for helping people find the rugged wisdom. From time to time, you're going to hear us talk about the Corbin Collective, and I wanted to fill you in on about what is the Corbin Collective. The Corbin Collective is the parent organization it's a platform of influence. We help men find some purpose, momentum, and clarity for their lives. We do that not only through the Rugged Wisdom podcast, but through a lot of events that happen throughout the year. Whether it's our Preserve event, which is a hunting event
expedition where we take guys backpacking on the Appalachian Trail. This year, we're going to the Grand Tetons in Yellowstone. I take every other year, we take a trip to the Holy Land. We tour Israel for 10 days. Also, our flagship program is called True North. And True North is an opportunity to take guys. We take somewhere 100 guys to the mountains each fall, and we do backpacking. We teach orienteering. You spend the day out hiking. It's a retreat in the mountains for men to find some clarity for their lives. So go to CorbinCollective.com, learn all about what we do, and I look forward to sharing more events with you in the future. So thanks for watching the podcast. Let's get back to the show.
Welcome back in to Rugged Wisdom. We are discussing Pinocchio. We are discussing a lot of things about Pinocchio. We were talking a little bit between the break, and I want to ask you a question because we hinted at this earlier. And kind of as I don't want to say a backdrop of this conversation, but as a precursor. We talked about the idea that the version of Pinocchio we're familiar with now, the Disney version. Let's just say the 2020 version. Is that when it came out?
Yeah, the original one, which was actually a landmark as far as what it did. The 1940 Disney film. So that's what we know growing up.
But then the latest
2020.
Okay.
Yeah, there has been a live action remake.
Got it.
In 2020.
So when we talk about that, we discussed how different it is. Just straight up, how different it is from the book. My question would be why?
Okay, it's different. How is it different? Because they changed the ending. Okay. So let me start here. When Disney in 1940 decided to use it, they stripped it of its geographical implications. I mean, it's like a little hamlet somewhere. It's like you don't know it's really Italy. There's things you can't really discern there. So they universalized the story.
Right.
Well, that's what Disney's doing. I get it. So they introduce characters differently than it is in the book. They make Pinocchio more affable. Right. They make Geppetto. They take some liberty. All right. So let's say you have the book, and then the 1940, it is a step away from that. All right. Well, so they take some creative licenses. But the one thing that Disney kept originally was, they made it more general, not even PG. They made it G rated. Because this book's not necessarily, I wouldn't say this is like general audience. No. It is like PG-13 at times, in a way, right?
Themes particularly.
The themes. So they had to put kid gloves on him, which is what they did. They literally put kid gloves on this Pinocchio. They make him affable, even as the clothing attire doesn't really tell us he's from Italy, that kind of thing. Now, 2020, that's the issue, because 2020, they took it a third step and literally changed the ending. And that's my problem.
Okay, discuss that, because when we hear that, when you hear a classic piece of literature ending changed, immediately I would imagine you got alarm bells going off. Like, that doesn't seem right. Well, dive into that a little.
All right, so in 2020, the producers of the live action changed the ending. And I think, they kind of stayed pretty true to, when I say they stayed true to the 1940 in some regards. But it's the major thing they changed at the ending of it. Because here's the thing. The whole thrust of Carlo Collodi was that the puppet, this wood, would become a real boy. All right? Now, let me put this in English. That the wood would become flesh.
Yes.
All right. Listen to me say that. That the wood would become flesh. Okay, theologically. That God would give us take our hearts of stone and give me a heart of flesh. That we would become there was a self-actualization, some transformation that has to happen in us to become the best version that God would have us to be.
We're intended to be.
That we're intended to be. Now, in 2020, they changed the ending, and spoiler alert, it's been 3 years, all right? It's been 3 years, and not many of you dudes are going to go watch it unless you're watching it with your kids. Here's the thing. The 2020 Disney version, he does not become a real boy.
Which, stop right there. That's huge.
Yeah.
Because that is the core of this book, is the journey toward becoming a boy.
It's
right,
and to becoming human, right, and that it's not just for Collodi. It's not that just that a boy becomes a man.
Yeah,
it's that in adolescence you have to even become really human being, and then you grow into being a man. But here's the problem: Disney in 2020, they changed the ending in a couple of ways where after he rescues his father from the belly of the beast, which is not then it's Monstro, but it's something else happens. So in the original, the blue fairy comes because what Pinocchio has to become is trustworthy, honest, and dependable, and a good friend. Like that's okay. There's a couple things he has to become.
Core values.
The core values. And so, Collodi's basically saying, here's the core values of what it means to be a good human. And when you become that, now you're becoming something, some transformation.
Right.
It is as if we have a rite of passage. I'm becoming a real person, a real man. I'm contributing to society. Well, what happens when we lower the bar?
Significantly.
And Disney has done this. Now, ask me about woke Disney. I mean, like you want to get me started.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother podcast about how the woke agenda has changed. But if you would say, okay, sometimes I tell my wife this stuff and she's like, come on. Like you're making it, she thinks I'm a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
And all, but I'm like,
go look it up.
No, but here's the thing. Okay, if you change the ending because, can I just read?
Please.
Like a review.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pinocchio changed. Pinocchio, he does rescue Geppetto. But after he does this, what happens is a single teardrop falls from his face and it lands on Geppetto, and Geppetto is revived. And at that moment, he, in the book and everywhere else, like, well, there's some things happen. So then there's a transformation that happens when he becomes a real boy.
Right.
Well, actually, in the live action 2020, Pinocchio doesn't become anything more than a puppet. Because here it says this. After this, there's no, I'm reading from a comment, or somebody said, there's no sign of the blue fairy to come and turn Pinocchio to a real boy. Instead, Geppetto tells Pinocchio. So, all right, he hears from his father these words, all right? Geppetto tells Pinocchio that even though he might not be a real boy, he is a truthful boy. That he's truthful. In that there's, at that point, so here's what Zemeckis, or whatever how you say this, that what does it mean to be truthful?
Right.
And to be full of truth? There's a transformation. It's just something. And so here's what they did. Pinocchio, this is a quote from the new. This is not in the book. This is the new movie. Pinocchio, when you first came to me, I might have made you think I wanted somebody else. Because there's a thing in the book, I was like, well, does he really want a real boy? He wants a real boy,
Right.
but he gets a puppet.
Right.
It's not, and it's like Pinocchio is not accepted by his father.
Right. Let's be clear.
And so he's like, you might have thought I wanted somebody else, but it was you I was wishing for. You will always be my real boy. There isn't a single thing I would change about you. And that's what Geppetto tells Pinocchio. And they embrace. They have this they embrace. And as they walk away hand in hand, this is the scene. They're walking away hand in hand, and the camera, the CGI, focuses on the wooden joints. Mm-hmm. And it is very clearly showing you he doesn't become a real boy. He's still a puppet. You see the hinging of his wooden. And here's the commentary. Jiminy Cricket, as they walk away, Jiminy Cricket in a voiceover. So in the end, Pinocchio did prove himself brave, honest, and unselfish. Okay, that's the characteristics. And since then, many stories have been told. So they're saying, like, this is our version.
Yeah.
Since then, many stories have been told. People say he was transformed into an honest-to-goodness real boy. Did that actually happen? Who knows? All right, so this is their out.
Sure it is.
They're changing the story, but they're saying, who knows? Which, okay, well, that's what woke culture does. There can be no absolute truth. Who knows? Cultural relativism. It's like, well, you make up your own version.
Yeah.
And you're entitled to your version of the truth. Okay, going on.
Yeah, continue.
But I do know one thing for sure. This is Jiminy Cricket.
Yeah.
I know something. Pinocchio is as real as any real boy could ever be. All right, so now here's what they're saying. He doesn't have to physically transform from a puppet to a real boy. as long as he's honest and truthful and kind and all these attributes. Okay. Well, then that point, Collodi says there has to be some transformation.
Sure.
You're writing this from a theological thing that there's this regenerative work of the Holy Spirit in us that we're regenerated, that we're made new, we're a new creation. So all of the Christology of becoming a new creation is lost.
Stripped away.
Stripped away.
Not just lost, I think intentionally stripped.
Yes, stripped away. Okay. So you're taking away this idea of a new, and you're like, Scott, why are you making such a big deal about this? It's because of this. I'm going to read the producer's words himself.
Yeah.
So Robert Zemeckis, I might be saying that name wrong. He's the producer.
The producer.
He wanted to make the story. They asked Zemeckis, why did you change the ending of Pinocchio? Here's his answer. We wanted to make the story more personal to the viewer. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. I'm quote, and I quote Robert Zemeckis. Everyone can go on Pinocchio's journey in a way that is pure in the sense that we're not telling the audience what they have to feel or what they have to think. Right? Because that's what cultural relativism is. Like, yeah, it's your truth.
Yeah, you figure it out.
You know, you figure it out and you'll discover your own personal truth. Who am I to say? Like, it cannot be any absolute truth. Right? Which I would say Carlo Collodi would be rolling in his grave going like, you missed the whole point.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The whole point of the story is to find something at the end. There is a goal. There
that
is
is
an
not
end point.
within you.
Right.
It is something that you discover, and so there's some transformation that becomes a part. It becomes in and through you, right?
Yes.
So Zemeckis says this. Audiences today are way more sophisticated. Way more sophisticated than an Italian Revolution audience.
By whose term?
Yeah, so they're way more sophisticated. And they don't want to be spoon-fed. I'm just quoting here. They want to be able to think for themselves. Okay, well, so that's what Collodi was saying. Pinocchio doesn't even know how to think for himself.
He's a doll.
He's a doll. It's so like because he doesn't know how to think. And so you have to understand that truth, it may exist outside of you.
Right.
And that's what Pinocchio learns, that there's a higher truth and you have to acquiesce to that truth to find yourself and bring yourself into an alignment with the truth. Well, Zemeckis says, and this is like people say, Scott, why are you so like angry? It's because when you tell people like, well, you know, invent your own version of truth.
Right.
You'll find it. And that's sophistication.
Yeah.
We're so sophisticated because, you know, isn't the Bible just like old fairy tales and like, that's so like antiquated.
Isn't it funny that that's the word he uses, sophisticated?
Oh, it's sophisticated because, well, who can argue with that? Because you tell people, and they don't want to be spoon-fed. They want to be able to think for themselves. So now the co-writer, Zemeckis, I'm not going to put all this at his feet. The co-writer, Chris Weitz, added, Pinocchio doesn't have to turn into a real flesh and blood boy. He is as real in that he has learned lessons and grown a conscience, but there's no need for him to end up a certain way physically for him to prove that. Geppetto has gone on a journey himself and realizes that Pinocchio is a person in his own right and is as real to him as any flesh and blood boy. Now, well, what does that mean?
That's a great question.
What does it mean? Well, I don't know what they mean by that, but I can tell you how I hear it. Mm-hmm. You know, Joe, you don't really have to be anything more than what you are right now for your father to accept you.
Right.
And that your father will just learn to accept you the way you are because you're trying.
My father will adapt, not me.
Right. Okay. Now here's why I say I think this is wrong. I think they're getting it wrong. Mm-hmm. Because when I read, you're putting words in Collodi's mouth. Maybe. But here's what I would say. Like, well, you know, Joe, your truth is your truth and you'll discover it. And as long as you're just nice, well, then that will be all the transformation that you need. Just be a nice boy. Just be truthful. Tell the truth. Be nice. But what if the truth demands some transformation? Isn't that what we're telling boys now? Don't become a real man. Like, just delay manhood till 27, 28, 30 now. And you just like, nothing will be required of you. Because here's what they want to say. We don't want make people to feel like they have to look a certain way or be a certain way to be accepted by the Father. Well, I understand the niceties of that. But here's
Sure.
what it teaches. Here's what it teaches. You just go be nice and discover your own truth, and you don't have to be transformed.
Mm-hmm. You're okay just the way you are.
You're okay just the way you are, and just that's sophistication.
Yes.
Now, you want to get me fired up, like.
Well, it's interesting. But it's only interesting, I say that not only, but because of the backdrop of this book and how it seems as though what you just discussed is the exact opposite of the point and the theme that the book is getting after.
I would say it is antithetical
Right?
to a coming-of-age story of Collodi going like, don't be a jackass. Like,
Right.
You've got to discern that there is something that you need to become something more than you are.
You cannot have a coming-of-age story without transformation.
Well, that's the point.
Right?
The coming of age is there. He went on a journey and he learned some lessons.
Right.
But there's a transformation that happens in every great story.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, let me put this in Christological terms.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Or put this in terms of reading it from a Christian perspective. So in the Christian perspective is that we have to die to self
Mm-hmm.
and be made new
Yes.
to be accepted by the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a hard truth.
Sure.
But sophisticated ears want to hear, you don't have to die to self. You don't have to become anything more than you for your Father to accept you.
Right. You
and
are
I'm like,
enough.
but you are enough.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the Christian message. I am not enough. I need a Savior. Yes. I need transformation. I need God to do a work in me and through me that I can't do.
Cannot do.
And I can't just discover. Okay. So Jesus had an interaction with a rich young ruler.
Mm-hmm.
And he came and he said, I have done it all. I've kept the law.
Yeah.
I've done everything. And Jesus goes, go sell everything you got. Well, I don't want to do that.
What?
And he went away angry. And Jesus does not track him down, that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't chase him down, that I read.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't apologize. And unapologetically says to the young ruler, just being a good boy isn't enough.
Right.
And I would think that that's kind of what Collodi is saying. Like, you can't just be good and discover your own truth, and that's your transformation.
There would be no need for the journey at that point, because what the journey cannot provide you anything. But when I read this book, and I think anybody else would too, it's about the journey. It's about figuring, because we talked about the misfortunes, right?
Sure.
There are misfortunes. There are things that happen. But that journey ultimately leads to a transformation, a very tangible transformation.
Sure. Yeah.
That the original, and going back to why should we read the original version? Well, there you go.
Yeah. And so it is that it's the work. And I would tell you, go back and read, when you read the book, read the Blue Fairy, the role of the Blue Fairy.
There's so much
and then
in this, yeah.
And at the end, watch the teardrop fall from Pinocchio and the absence of the Blue Fairy. So, here a bunch of dudes sitting around talking about fairies.
Yeah, but it's so
But
good.
that's the point. And so I would tell you that when I read this book, why does it matter? Because we live in a culture where we tell young boys, you really don't have to become something you don't want to be.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the 2020 version of Pinocchio is soft in that it promulgates a problem that we are attacking masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're like, that's a jump. That's a far jump. No, I don't think it's a
That's
far
what we've
jump.
been discussing.
I don't think it's a far jump to tell someone, well, just be the best version of you, and there's nothing you're not going to have to die to self and become something more.
Yeah.
And I find that to just be, okay. So when they asked the writers and the producer, why'd you do this? They're like, well, this is what the audience wants.
Right.
They're sophisticated, and they don't want to be spoon-fed. They don't want to be told what to do.
Isn't that spoon feeding though? Ultimately,
that's
right?
what I'm saying.
Right.
That's what you have done.
Yeah.
Is sometimes we just need truth.
Yeah.
Well, he found truth, and he's a truthful boy, and that's I went on a tangent.
It's interesting. I would also say I'm assuming every copy has this introduction in it now.
Most do have the introduction.
I would very much encourage reading it before you read the book. I think some books we don't necessarily read the introduction. This is rich. It gives you the author's history. It actually almost gives you the story before the story, but it doesn't give anything away. It's super rich, super insightful. That would be my one thought too. It's a great book. I'm again, we've said this almost every podcast episode, but we could continue talking about this. We didn't even, touch the tip of the iceberg. But I do think it's important to have, if you listen to this, maybe it's like, okay, maybe you don't even go read it, maybe you don't, but at least you have an understanding of where we're coming from.
Maybe a working knowledge. I do like in the introduction, because there is a genre literature that this is, and it's called a Bildungsroman.
Okay.
It's a word people may not know, but it's called a Bildungsroman. And the Bildungsroman is like a tale of, it's an extended metaphor of a child growing into maturity. And it's called a Bildungsroman. And so when you read it, I hope people that they're like, oh, okay, so this is not just an affable puppet boy story. This is at the heart of like, I'm raising kids. So do I tell my kids at some point, just go find your own version of truth?
Right.
Just go, or is it like,
Does
no,
that really help?
And life is going to be hard. And life is going to suck, and at times you're going to be left for dead. Like that's the whole. You're going to
have to figure it out.
And you're going to have to figure it out. And at times, like I can't. So the father can't rescue the Pinocchio. That there you will come to an end at something where you're going to have to go through it. It's why Jesus on the cross said, he said, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani" in Aramaic. My God, why have you forsaken me? Like, it's on you, boy.
Yeah.
The sins of the world on you, and you're going to have to pass through that, and you're going to go into hell and the harrowing of hell, which is a beast, the belly of the beast. And so I would say that I really want people to read the story to go like, man, like it is such a great metaphor for us to understand what Christ has done for us. And then what do I do with that?
Yeah.
As a man?
We're not always going to have a foam pit. I always like to think of it that way. You're not, when you jump, it's not always going to be there.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what we're trying to, well, I don't know. Sophistication, though.
Yeah, man, soften it up a little bit. Anyway, you heard me go off on woke Disney culture and that kind of, I could go a lot about that. But I'm not coming at it unmerited.
No, sure.
I'm like, well, okay, here's an example of like how we're changing the stories.
Right.
And I think it's a tragedy to original literature and by which it was written.
Well, original literature, we're going to have a lot of it.
We're going to get into a lot of this.
I want to say, so when we first thought about the podcast and we discussed it, now obviously this is in sequence, our second book review. When I thought about what we were going to be doing, I questioned whether or not we would be able to get to a point in these where we would leave an audience and even myself saying, man, I want to read that. I really believe I hope, and that's a question. I hope we're doing that because I feel like we are. I really enjoy I don't know. It's a different way of looking at things.
This is an easy one too to approach because you could read The Adventures of Pinocchio like in a couple of evenings. If you just said, "I'm gonna read for a couple," read for a couple chapters a evening, you can knock it out, and then you can watch either the classic Disney version or the new one, and then like with your family.
Yeah.
I think this is a great conversation to watch it with your kids, to watch Pinocchio with your kids. And then like, okay, did we just watch a cool story or is like, hey, this is...
Yeah.
And I think that this is a great book and movies to watch with your kids and have conversations. So this is a great entry point. If someone, what do I do with this? Well, go read the book, watch the movies, and come to your own conclusions.
We're going to have a lot of it. We're going to have more books. We're going to have more interviews, topics, all of the above. And they won't all be Pinocchio, but man, I kind of like Pinocchio.
No, we're going to span, man, we're going to get from everywhere from Carlo, Collodi, Pinocchio. We're going to go back. We're probably going to do some ancient literature as well. And we're going to get to some classics, some theologians, some historic. Like, it's going to be a fun ride.
A lot of fun ride. That's kind of what we're trying to do here. Just have fun. We got a lot of books behind us. So, I mean, we're going to keep rolling with it. Rugged Wisdom. Scott Johnson, Joe Wedra. I believe our social handles will be somewhere around here. You can follow us and keep listening along. We're excited for the journey and appreciate you. Thank you so much for listening to this one. We'll hear you next time on Rugged Wisdom.